David Chapel Missionary Baptist Church Praise Team.
Our nation on the question of race. In a moment, I will have the privilege of talking to them about the movements they waged beginning 2 generations ago, what those efforts mean today, and what we can learn from them as we continue our quest for equality for Americans in the 21st century. Afterward, Terrence Green, the Associate Professor at the Department of Education, Leadership, and Policy here at UT, will lead a conversation on the long history of division between law enforcement and minority communities. Contributing to that discussion will be Art Acevedo, the Chief of the Houston Police Department, and DeRay McKesson, civil rights activist and organizer. Now to get started on the Summit of Race in America, please join me in welcoming to this stage Dolores Huerta and Andrew Young. What a way to begin this summit. We are truly honored to have you here at the Summit on Race in America. And we live in a city that has boulevards, as so many other cities do, named for Cesar Chavez and Martin Luther King. And I wonder if we could start off by talking about how you got involved in the movements that have defined your lives. And Dolores, we'll start with you. How, in the mid-1950s, did you get swept up in the labor movement?
Well, excuse me. Well, actually, I was organized by a great gentleman named Fred Ross Sr., who invited me to a house meeting where he explained to us how in East Los Angeles, they were able to bring in street lights and sidewalks and clinics. And actually, the thing that really hooked me, how they sent police to prison for beating up Mexican-American young people. And I thought, that's a lot of power. How can you kind of create that kind of power to make changes in the community? And we started working on many pieces of legislation, including getting voting ballots in Spanish, driver's licenses in Spanish, getting public assistance for people who were legal immigrants to the country, and changing the voter registration laws so that people who were citizens could register another person to vote. Unlike Texas, where you still have to find a deputy registrar somewhere to register you. And then at that point in time, they had a lot of people from Mexico under a HTA program, and the farm workers were treated very, very badly. And the domestic workers, the local farm workers, their wages had dropped so low to 50 cents an hour. and people were living in really terrible conditions. And so once I learned that you can change things by bringing people together and taking direct action, I thought, that's what I want to do for my life, and I'm still doing it.
For which we are profoundly grateful. Mr. Ambassador, how did you get involved in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, where you worked with Dr. King?
Well, actually, I was born into it, I think. I was born in New Orleans with an Irish grocery store on one corner, an Italian bar on another, and the Nazi party was on the third corner. And my father, at 4 years old, explained to me that white made of one blood all the nations of the world. And they don't know that, but you can't help them to see it if you're going to act like they act, or if you're going to ever get angry. And my first lesson at 4, and I remember because it was 1936, and that was when Jesse Owens in the Berlin Olympics, and that was the lesson he took me to see how Jesse Owens dealt with Hitler. And so it was just, I've always known that I was blessed. And I've always heard that to them to whom much has been given, of them is much required. And I drifted around in the South and went north for a while, National Council of Churches, and then came back to Atlanta, and I was put in an office right across the hall from Martin Luther King. And I was working for the United Church of Christ. And his secretary said, look, you're here by yourself, your wife's over in Alabama, you're gonna get in trouble in Atlanta if you don't find something to do in the evenings. And my suggestion is that you take some of Dr. King's mail home with you and you help him answer his mail. And so I started off answering an egg crate full of mail.
Wow.
And he didn't know me, and I'd met him, but it just, he had a similar background. He was from a privileged family. His daddy was a banker as well as a preacher. And his grandfather was the was the treasurer of the National Baptist Convention, which had 6 million members. So it was understood from birth that he had to lead something. And that he was born to lead. And he ran from it and did everything he could to avoid it. In fact, he went to Montgomery thinking that this is the sleepiest, quietest, most conservative town in the South, and I can just be a pastor and mind my own business. Well, you
then
know
Rosa
what
Parks got
happened.
on a bus, right?
Yeah.
We have seen setbacks in recent years, and we've seen an undeniable rise in white supremacy, not only here in the United States, but throughout the world. Ambassador, you're from Louisiana, and just in the last 2 weeks, we've seen 3 historically black churches bombed. We saw what happened at the mosque in New Zealand last month. What do you think has led to this rise in white nationalism?
I blame everything on the economy. That we're living in a global economy, and we still only have a national vision. And everybody wants things to be national, but it cannot be. And we were moving in the right direction, I think. And I think that science and technology is global, but our politics is still national. And you don't, I mean, I don't want to call a name, but nobody reflects this conflict of interest more than our national leadership that has a nationalist vision but all of their economics is global. And all of their money comes from somewhere else.
Doris, what's your view? Why have we seen this spike in white supremacy?
Well, I think it's both. I think it is the economy. And I think in the 60s and 70s, we had what I call a cultural revolution. But I think this next revolution, evolution that we're in, has to be an economic evolution, because we have this huge disparity of wealth, where you have 1% of the wealthy families own 50% of the wealth, and 10% of the wealthy corporations and families own 50% of the wealth in the United States of America. But I also think it has a lot to do with education, and that we haven't been able to, or even tried, I think, to eliminate racism. And the reason I say it's part of our education, because we do not teach our children, starting with kindergarten, the real history of the United States of America. And we do not teach them that Native Americans who were victims of genocide in our land, but they were the first slaves. And we do not teach our children that African slaves built Washington, D.C., the White House and the Congress, and all of those federal buildings over there. And all of the immigrants that came here, people from Mexico, from Asia, the Philippines, China, Japan, India, all of these people of color that came here to build this country. And so I think our children of color, they never get that dignity that they deserve. And our white children, our Anglo children, still have that poison of white supremacy and white privilege. And I think that that's one thing that we have to do to eliminate racism. And then, of course, the fallout then comes when the resources are allocated in our country. And we're the richest country in the world. And there is no reason why we shouldn't have more equity, more equality in education in the way that the resources are allocated. There's no reason why we shouldn't have free college tuition for everybody, free health care for everyone, like they have in the Scandinavian countries, like they have in Cuba, which is a small country that has an economic boycott. And I don't think that we have really put forth the will and the intention to eliminate racism. And I think racism is used to keep the country divided. And not just racism, but when you talk to gender equality, women's reproductive rights, the inclusion and equality for our LGBT community. And unless those issues are addressed, well, they can divide people and keep people separated. And in the meantime, nobody's paying attention to what's happening with the economy, you know? Because we're so busy fighting each other down here at this level, and we can see that the wealth of our country is not being distributed the way that it should by all of our citizens in this country.
I want to go back to you mentioned education. We are not teaching our kids about minorities in history. There have been efforts in a number of states, including this one, to essentially suppress those stories. And you have said when you deny them their stories, you deny them their power. How do we ensure that the stories of minorities are being taught in our public schools?
Well, I think taking over school boards, taking over the Department of Education, putting in those curriculums. I think every child should see the story of Emmett Till, a young man who was killed in Mississippi because he was supposedly whistled at a white woman. And they have to see the story of Matt Shepard, a young gay student who was killed because he was gay. You know, and the stories also, you know, we're in Texas right now, but I like to say to people, someday when you have time, Google and see what the map of the United States looked like before 1847. And it's a shocker when you look and you see a third of the United States was Mexico. You know, a third of the United States was Mexico. And all of that suppression and discrimination against Latinos and African American people in the state of Texas, that all comes from slavery, it comes from domination, it comes from occupation.
I'm the optimist, though. I refuse to think that we're slipping back. And the reason is that we were so close that I was with Dr. King when President Johnson said, "We shall overcome." And we were sitting in Selma, and I saw tears drip down his eyes. because we were almost there. And the next election, we lost by 1 vote per precinct. And we've been looking for a message ever since. I think President Johnson was the icing on the cake that Franklin Roosevelt started baking. And then all of a sudden, we slipped back. And we slipped back politically because it takes 60% of the population to make change politically. But medicine is going ahead. Technology is making rapid rise. My symbol of the future is an ad. I don't know whether it's been here in Texas, but it's a cancer cell being eaten up by another cancer cell. And it says how far technology has taken us. Now, we just have not been able to get, well, and to keep it from being racial, and I don't want to make it racial, I want it not to be racial. It's all white folks between Brexit and Europe. You know, I mean, that's got nothing to do with race. That is England, and we have 4,000 German companies in Georgia. Because Germany realized that they were too big for Europe. And one of the things I started working on when I was mayor was getting people who were growing too big for their own countries to come here. Now, that's also true of, I mean, almost everybody here is an immigrant, except us. And maybe we are too, coming, you know, and so making sense of this complicated world is going to take a little time, but it's happening, I think. And the thing that messes up the politics is not only the slogans and the needs, but it's well, when I put all my money into television, somebody advised me that I lost. When I kept the money and started knocking on doors and organizing people block by block, I haven't lost the race since.
All right.
But television cannot change the hearts and minds of people, and I think that's where we have been missing out.
Well, yes, please.
Yeah, I would just say, when we talk about science, and there's some basic scientific facts that I think everyone needs to know and reaffirm. And when I go around talking to students all over the country, I like to say this, that we are one human race. We're Homo sapiens. And I challenge the audiences to say, okay, so we have a lot of different ethnic groups, a lot of different cultures, a lot of different nationalities, but we only have one human race. And I will challenge people to say, okay, where did our human race begin? Where are the origins of our human race? And the answer is very simple. It's Africa. It's Africa. And so I like to say that we are all Africans. We're all Africans of different shades and colors, right? Because that's who we are. And so we can say to the Ku Klux Klan and to the neo-Nazis and all of those white nationalists, get over it, you're all Africans, okay? Just get over it. So I think that, and I think that we do have to address the issue of race. Because we can't, as I said before, we can't use that to divide us. And I think it's incumbent upon every organization, be it public or private, that they start addressing the issue of race to make sure that people of color are included you know? And so we can, like right now, my organization, the Dolores Huerta Foundation, we're working on stopping the school-to-prison pipeline because we have so many people of color, African Americans and Latinos that are in our prison system. And that is a whole other issue when we have more people in prison in the United States of America than they do in India or China. And part of it has to do with what Reverend Young said about economics and about job opportunities. But how can we justify that in our country? How can we justify that? So we've got to change that whole system so that if we don't have enough jobs, or is that why we're putting people in prison? Because we don't have enough jobs. I mean, and the other thing about the whole immigration issue, incarcerating people because they enter the country without documents, before we didn't do that. People came into the country, they deported them. They didn't put them in a jail. And we have seen the horror now of seeing immigrants that come here and have their children taken away from them. Many of them don't even know where their children are. Yeah. I mean, that's the ultimate horror of these type of policies that are against people of color. Yeah.
I want to come back to the issue of immigration in a moment, Dolores. But I want to ask my fellow African, Ambassador Young. You said last year, I'm frankly worried about white people. They blame their poverty on our success. What did you mean by that?
Well, you turn on your television set, and you know, and Monday night it's all black people. Tuesday night it's kind of mixed. Wednesday night it's empire. You know, and you go to a football game, you go to a basketball game. I mean, you know, I can't root for Virginia here in Texas, but I like to see white boys playing basketball. You know, that they shouldn't give up. But if you don't have those opportunities, and if you don't have the kind of coaching and the kind of thing that's open, public, you begin to feel like this used to be, my daddy was an All-American, but that was before integration. You know, and I can't be an All-American now. So but those are necessary adjustments that you become something else. And the world is expanding. But I enjoyed the Country Music Festival last night. And I love country music because I want to I can understand. See, I think the song of the year was something about bear my burdens. I identify with that. That could be black or white. It was wonderful when Ray Charles and Willie Nelson did Georgia as a duet. That we've got to work on things like that. Our families don't just get along without help. And we've got a huge family. And the leadership, instead of bringing us together, is dividing us.
So can you remedy that at a grassroots level, Mr. Ambassador? How do you remedy that resentment among a wide swath of the white population?
Well, in a city like Atlanta, you make sure that you never, I mean, the majority of the population seems to be black. It's not. It's just that the politics is black. So you make sure you do not have a committee that doesn't have every neighborhood represented on it. And it can be gay and straight, or white and black, or rich and poor, but you have to structure democracy so that it represents every facet of our society.
follow up on what Reverend, I think it has to be intentional. It has to be very, very intentional, as you said, to make sure that everybody is represented. And that it's absolutely the issue of race, but I think it's also the issue of gender, of women, and also of our LGBT community. And you know, I have been quoting Coretta Scott King a lot, and she had a statement that said that we will never have peace in the world until women take power. But I have amended Coretta's statement to say we will never have peace until feminists take power, because we know that not all women support reproductive rights, right, or immigrants' rights, or environmental issues, etc. And so that's why I have amended that. But I think it's so I think that. But everyone Young was just saying it's got to be intentional. That's what I meant when I say that every public and private institution has to be intentional. To make sure that people of color are included at all levels, and that women are included, and LGBT people are included at all levels. And that's why we start breaking it down. And I think in terms of the Anglo community, of those people that are not yet enlightened, as I like to say, that we continue talking to them because they don't know. You know, they forget that when Europeans came to this country, and it was a brown country to begin with Native American people that were here. So when people say they don't belong in our country, they don't know what they're talking about. You know, they don't know what they're talking about. So I think continuing to educate people and trying to teach them to kind of rid them of what they've been brought up with, and this hateful rhetoric, and this idea that somehow if you're a different skin color, you're less of a human being. And like in the farm worker movement, you know, they have farm workers out there working in the fields without toilets. Can you imagine what it was like for women? You know, without toilets, without drinking water, without rest periods. I mean, that's a dehumanization. And this is what a lot of racism is, it's dehumanizing people. Even this whole thing, again, on television, where you constantly portray people of color as criminals. You know, and so people start getting that in their minds, and right away they are suspicious of or fearful of people of color.
You're fond of quoting a friend of yours from Stanford who said, "We didn't cross the border crossed us." What do you mean by that?
Well, as I said before about this all being part of Mexico, you know, and like my family, I was born in New Mexico. You know, and my grandparents were born in the state of New Mexico, so they were already there when they made this the border across the Mexican border. But the other thing is, it applies to everybody because we are all the American continent. And you know, before people would travel all the way from Peru all the way to New Mexico, they have found relics there of chocolate that were in clay vessels, and people went back and forth. There was no border. And hopefully someday it'll be like John Lennon's song, Imagine, you know, but we will have no borders and no wars.
There was and Doris, you said, I want to get both of you to comment on this. You've said that in the 1960s there was an ambiance that you could change the world. There was this kind of intersectionality between movements. They were aligned and synergies came to bear in the movements. Do you see that spirit today? This is a question for both of you. Do you see that spirit today? Are there movements that are lining up where there are synergies toward social change?
Yeah, I see it and I'm afraid of it. Because the movement, I mean, we had a hard time getting along with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. We got along pretty good with CORE, because they were based on nonviolence, but the Urban League was business-oriented, and the NAACP was legally. And think of the clash between Martin Luther King advocating civil disobedience and Thurgood Marshall going to the Supreme Court. Right. And he'd been working on that since the early 40s. And here we come along in the 60s with a challenging laws. It's really very complicated. Now, A. Philip Randolph held us together during that period. But it's very hard now. And I frankly think that we lost the last election because we were supporting candidates and not change.
Right.
And now with so many candidates, it scares the hell out of me. And you know, just pick one. And let's get behind her or him, and let's just move the country forward. And she doesn't have to be black, brown, or she has to have a message, or he has to have a message that brings us back into the leadership of the free world. The world cannot run without American vision. It just cannot do it. So Europe and Latin America and Africa depend on a vision from the United States of America. And that vision requires all of us, with all of our diversity, coming together and finding a vision. A vision, because there's enough water, there's enough food, there's enough air, there's enough in this world for all of us to survive and live together as brothers. If we fight each other, we're going to perish together as fools.
Dolores, our president said today that the border is closed, that this country is full, that we don't have room for anyone else. Is that good for America's future, in your view?
Well, I heard once that you could put all of the people of the world into Texas. And they would all fit, you know, all the people in the world. But I want to also address, excuse me, this issue of the different movements, you know. And I do believe that young people are, excuse me, that young people are making it happen. Because I think the young people that are out there from Parkland, Florida, that are trying to stop gun violence, that they are also very much involved in the whole issue of fighting racism and homophobia and all of these other, and climate change, the big issues that we have today. And I think the one thing that we have today, that they have today, that we didn't have when we started, were our devices, you know, our cell phones, our Twitter, Facebook, so they can get the message out there very rapidly.
You can mobilize a movement.
Yeah, they can mobilize very, very rapidly and get information out there. The other thing is, everything has to be transparent. They can find out, you know, where the money's at, who's backing who. And so I feel very hopeful, and I do believe, but the one thing that really worries me a lot is that many young people don't believe in voting. And they have to vote, because it's not enough to march, it's not enough to protest. I mean, that's the one thing that came out of the civil rights movement, is everyone is a good example of that. But you have to get people elected to office, because ultimately everything has to end up in a policy, a written policy that's enforceable, or a law that is enforceable. If not, it's got to be concrete, it's got to be there, it's got to be, and in order to get there, we have to elect people to office. Right. And we got to elect progressive people to office that are going to pass those laws. And I just have to mention that in Texas, for instance, people can't even register to vote. You got to find a deputy registrar somewhere, and they have the voting laws in Texas that we had in California over 50 years ago. And so we wonder, why is Texas so behind in labor laws, women's rights, et cetera, et cetera? It's because people can't vote in Texas. And I know we're here at the Lyndon B. Johnson Library, and President Johnson was famous for signing the voting rights law into effect. But here we have a lot of voter suppression, not only in Texas, but many other states.
So you said backstage that is your greatest concern. There were allegations of voter suppression in Georgia.
It wasn't suppression. It really wasn't suppression. They stole whole precincts of votes. And, you know, imperfect as it is, still have to make the country work. But it's lining up against us now because we're going to court, but the judges have been stacked right on up to the Supreme Court. And it's a challenge for us. And I think my hope is that we will have such a clear delineation of values that we can create some kind of unity around some human being that will give us a global vision that allows all of God's children to share in the wealth of the earth.
Mr. Arbesher, you saw virulent voting suppression in the South. And you on this stage, you told a story of going to see President Johnson with Martin Luther King in 1964, right after he had come back from Oslo, where he received the Nobel Peace Prize. And President Johnson said to you and Dr. King, "I'd love to give you a voting rights bill, but I don't have the power." And you walked out of that meeting, and Dr. King, you said, "What do you think?" And Dr. King said, "I think we've got to give this president some power." After Selma, you said he had all the power he needed. What do you do today to combat voting suppression?
I think you still have to, well, I think we've got a good platform. I call it a free enterprise democracy, but it has to be free and fair. And in order to do that, we've got to reconcile a global economy with our national economies. And I think I wish we could have more talk about how we're going to pay for all of our dreams. We can do it, but we've got to think through the details. Nobody thought we could get this far with health care, but the affordable health care certainly saves me and a lot of other people in my age group. We couldn't make it. So, and I think that the young people understand that if we had taken the tax cut and wiped out student loans, it's the same amount. It's the same $1.5 trillion wiped out student loans. We would have flooded the economy with housing, with jobs, with investment. I mean, we educate people, and then we put the shackle of debt around them to keep them from, and that's just not intelligent. It's not racial. And I think and the reason I try to deracialize everything is because I think that ultimately we're going to have to do it as one nation, indivisible under God. And we can't do that unless we come together in some significant way.
I'm going to quote you, Mr. Ambassador, and I'm going to ask both of you to comment on this quote. You've said, "It is complicated to change this world. Change comes little by little. Nothing worthwhile can happen in one generation." But did you expect we'd be further in the realization of equal rights for all Americans to this point when you started waging the movements that you began fighting 2 generations ago? Dolores, did you think we'd be further ahead?
Well, I mean, I saw, I'm going to be 89 years old in a couple of days.
And it will be Dolores where today? In California, Oregon, and Washington, is that right?
New Mexico.
New Mexico and Washington.
Yeah, and it is good to see some changes. You know, it is good in my lifetime, you know, that I have seen some changes. And I guess living 89 years is maybe more than one generation. But I do believe that the energy of the next generation, of the generation that we have now, and the intelligence that they have, even those that don't go to college, I think it is going to change things more rapidly than what we think. I think we're seeing that happen now, even with just the advent of television. You know, I remember they'd say that during the Vietnam War, that was the first war that was televised. And then we saw what an impact that made. And people are going to start questioning, okay, why are we having these wars? Why are we in the Middle East? Why are we spending billions of dollars to fight a war that doesn't seem to end, you know? And I like to say that this idea of U.S. domination over other countries, talking about the refugees at the border, I always like to say the jillions of dollars that we spend on bananas with the people of Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, they never see that money because all of that money goes to American corporations. We now have this talk about doing something in Venezuela. And the whole fight with Venezuela was when Hugo Chavez said the oil of Venezuela belongs to the people of Venezuela. And we have had economic sanctions against Venezuela for the last 8 years. So this whole idea that other governments, if they don't agree with our economic systems, that somehow we should go against them or try to dominate them, I think that's, we can't have a global world if our United States always wants to dominate other countries and think that their resources belong to us. Instead of us helping those other countries develop their own economy, like we did in World War II with Japan and Germany. You know, after we defeated those countries in the war, we actually had the Marshall Plan, where U.S. tax dollars went to help those countries grow their economies, and now they're very strong countries. Well, we could do that with other countries in the world. So if we want to have peace in the world, then we've got to let other countries develop and not have this whole idea that, as I said before, that their resources belong to us. Right. You know.
But there's more than enough money, and I've been worried about the money that this offshore money that everybody has. And if we could find a way just to bring some of that back, I worry about the Mississippi River because I grew up on the river. And it floods every year. I think the cost of flooding last year was something like $384 billion. Well, with maybe $125 billion, we could have prevented some of that flooding. I mean, we've got to think about things in different terms. And I think we can. I went to Costa Rica when I was at the UN, and the president of Costa Rica pulled down a map of the Caribbean and Central area. He said, "What do you see here?" I said, "I see some beautiful islands and some wonderful countries." He said, "No." He said, "This is a continent. If you think of the water," he said, "you all took 150, 200 years to get expressways to get from one place. We have waterways that can get us from Jamaica and Cuba to Costa Rica, you know, just as quick and at no cost. If the United States thought of the Caribbean basin as a continent, starting with Mexico and going all the way around to Cuba and all of the northern rim, we would be your largest trading partner. And people wouldn't have to come here. They would be employed. We should be working on probably the third Panama Canal by now. It'll pay for itself. And it's just a matter of a global vision to solve global problems. And China's gonna, I mean, China looks good right now because they're an authoritarian state, but only 500 million of 1.5 billion people are a part of that economy. They got 1 billion people that are gonna raise hell someday. And they're gonna have worse problems than we are. India has been nursing itself along. Africa is finally doing much better, but the way the Chinese are moving there, they're going to own all the minerals. And so if somebody's got to start thinking about how we make sense of this planet.
We're out of time. I'm going to, though, ask for 3 more minutes, and please.
I just want to say, and I think a lot of it is this idea of profit-driven. You know, if everything has to be about making more and more and more money. And so this is why we have this imbalance, because everything, like the planes that just crashed, the Boeing planes that just crashed, because they wanted to save money. And I talked to one of the engineers, a previous engineer from Boeing, who said that they outsourced the manufacturing of some of the parts. And so when they try to put all those back together again, sometimes they just don't work again. Why do they do that? To save money. I mean, this is like, we can't have this whole idea that it's got to be more and more money, more and more wealth. Instead of thinking, as Evo Morales, the president of Bolivia, says, we have to live better. I mean, we have to live well, not better. You know, so I think if we can think of sharing wealth equally so that we don't have homeless people on the street, you know, so that people can be taken care of regardless if they're physically ill or mentally ill. Somehow we say, well, they're just mentally ill, the people that are homeless. Well, how about taking care of them if they're ill? So I think our whole concept has to change about the way we take care of people to make sure that everybody has food and everybody has shelter, and not this horrible imbalance of wealth.
Again, we've run out of time, but I'm going to ask one more very quick question. Martin Luther King said, "Let us realize that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends slowly toward justice." You're finishing my sentence, Mr. Ambassador. You were on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel when when Dr. King was gunned down, and Dolores, you were with Bobby Kennedy at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles when he was assassinated, standing next to him when he was...
We were both together with Cesar Chavez when he broke his fast and came out of jail.
Yeah.
So what sustained you during the darkest times? What gives you hope during those times? And what allowed you to continue to wage the movements where you made such a profound difference?
Well, I don't believe in death. I mean, I just don't believe that there is an end to life. I think that we are basically spiritual beings. And while death, Dr. King used to say, is the ultimate democracy, everybody's got to die. But you don't, and he said, you can't tell when you die, what you die, how you die. The only decision you have is what is it you give your life for. But life does not end with death. And my grandmama told me that. So, and she believed that, and she prayed that at 80, she was 89 when she just asked God, take me home. I'm tired of this. And it's that spirituality. Our movement was all spiritual. We didn't, I mean, Selma wasn't supposed to happen. I mean, it was on the wrong day. I mean, the March, Bloody Sunday was on the wrong day. Everybody made a mistake and didn't know when the second Sunday was in March. And Martin Luther King wasn't there because it was the first Sunday and he had to be in church. If he had been there, President Johnson would have had the Justice Department there wouldn't have been a Bloody Sunday. It was a mistake that caused Bloody Sunday. Now, as bad as it looked on television, and it was bad, I don't think anybody died that day. And I don't even think there were bones broken. And we went on to march to Montgomery, and we got a Civil Rights Act. But almost everything that happened in the movement that I experienced had a spiritual element in it that it was almost like when we got to the end of our journey and could think of nothing else, something else happened that we didn't plan on, we didn't understand, but something happened that made a difference. And Ralph Abernathy used to say, I don't know what the future may hold, but I know who holds the future.
I want to offer our thanks to both of you for not only being here tonight and opening up this conference, but for all you have done for our future. Thank you very much for being here.
Could I ask a question of the audience?
Dolores Huerta has one parting thought. Sorry.
No, I just want to ask the question and the audience a question, and I know you know the answer. And the question I'm going to ask you is, who's got the power? And I want you to yell out, we've got the power. And when I say what kind of power, I want you to say people power. Can we do that? And yell it really out loud so all those people who are not yet enlightened, I'll call them racist, misogynists, homophobes, okay, climate deniers, so that they can hear us, okay? So let me shout it out really loud. Who's got the power? What kind of power?
People power.
Okay, are we going to go out there and organize? What do we say? ¿Se puede? That means yes, we can, okay? Okay, let's say yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
And in Spanish, sí se puede. Sí se puede. Muchas gracias. Thank you.